do it for the right reasons. We need to do it for the future of this country and for American families.
Now, the senator from Mississippi mentioned the way this came about and the comments of the majority leader, that I can't really believe that he believes. It's just hard for me to believe that he thinks this is working. He is not a fool. But you know, I'm also have been listening to the debate, just like you and I talked about earlier, that we did on the floor leading up to the vote on Christmas Eve 2009. I've been listening to the debate last night and today by some of our colleagues, and I thought our colleague from Nebraska, Senator Johans, made a very profound statement. We're fortunate to serve in my opinion, the greatest legislative body in the world. You and I spent a number of years in the House, and that is a great institution also. They're both unusual from a constitutional and legislative standpoint. But you have certain rights in the United States Senate in the minority that you don't have in the House. And the American people know and understand what's happened here, and that is that the Democrats in the Senate 2 weeks ago broke the rules of the Senate to change the rules of the Senate. And they did so in a very arbitrary way, almost a mean-spirited way that basically ignored the arguments of the minority. And the minority in the Senate has always had rights up until this rule change a couple of weeks ago. And the senator from Nebraska said today that when we were debating on this floor during the late fall leading up to the vote in December of 2009, that because the Democrats had 60 votes, that they looked to the minority on our side of the aisle and they said, "We don't care what you say." His direct quote was, "Sit down and shut up." And he felt a very eerie feeling taking place 2 weeks ago during the debate on this floor where the Democrats broke the rule to change the rule, and they looked on this side of the aisle and said, "We don't care what the parliamentarian says. We don't care what the rules of the Senate have been for decades and decades and decades. We're going to change those rules, and y'all can sit down and shut up." I thought what Senator Johans said was pretty significant, and he was right on track. I want to mention one other major concern that I have with this bill that I'm sure my friend from Mississippi has heard also, and that has to do with the safety of personal information relative to this new health care system. Obamacare opens the door to fraud and identity theft like we've never seen in a public program. When individuals visit the exchange and apply for health insurance coverage, they have to provide sensitive personal data, such as Social Security numbers, income, and tax return information. This information is then stored in a federal data service hub. The proper security safeguards for that federal data hub and other components of the website have not been put in place. Despite repeated warnings about this, the administration insisted on moving forward. If the rollout of healthcare.gov is an indication of what is to follow, then I agree with Americans who have serious reservations about the security of their personal information when applying for health insurance coverage through the exchanges. The presiding officer and I sit on the Intelligence Committee together, and we hear daily during our briefings about cyber attacks taking place against the federal government in the United States, against private entities in the United States, as well as against individuals inside the United States. I can only imagine, with all the problems that we've seen with the getting up and simply having this website of healthcare.gov running, that some 15-year-old sitting in his garage somewhere in America, or maybe sitting in Beijing or Tehran, looking to have some fun, could hack into the computer system and retrieve all the personal information of any individual that they wanted to, including their Social Security number.
Or more than have fun. Engage in real mischief and real harm to American citizens, Senator.
Yeah. You're exactly right, and obviously we know what that would lead to. Those hackers that are attacking America today are getting proprietary information as well as financial remuneration, unfortunately, in too many instances. And to open your book, open your personal information book to the federal government is something that rightfully, in my mind, has the American people upset, and is a provision in this health care plan that certainly is not popular, and is something, again, that, you know, as Nancy Pelosi said, well, let's pass it, then we'll read it, and then we'll figure it out. Well, here we go again. It's another provision in there that nobody knew anything about. We had no debate, as the senator from Mississippi referred to earlier, about another issue on the floor of this House, floor of the Senate, regarding having to provide personal information.
Well, if I can underscore that, there is no question Americans, because of the Snowden matter, because of other breaches of confidentiality and security, Americans are more and more concerned about this. I note that our colleague from Maryland, Senator Mikulski, said about Obamacare that it is causing fear, doubt, and a crisis of confidence. And I have to feel that some of the lack of confidence that the American people have are the very real concerns about security. It's no wonder that a Pew survey released this week shows 54% of Americans disapprove the health care law, and only 41% are in favor of it. And yet, my friend mentioned the former Speaker of the House, the current minority leader in the House of Representatives, who just this year said the implementation of this law is fabulous. Fabulous. Compared it to the Declaration of Independence's guarantee of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. According to the former Speaker, this is what this is all about. I think Americans, more and more members of this body, are concluding that this law isn't fabulous, contrary to what the former Speaker said, that Obamacare is not wonderful for America, contrary to what the current majority leader of the Senate said. And I would hope that we could even yet revisit this. I think we only have about 5 minutes to go, Mr. President. If I could comment a brief moment about the breaking of the rules, to change the rules that occurred. One would have thought that hardly any nominations were getting through. To hear our friends on the other side of the aisle justify the reason for changing years and years of precedent, and for going back on an agreement that we made mid-year, an agreement that we made back in January, and a Gang of 14 agreement that was made by some of the most distinguished people ever to have served in the United States Senate. As a matter of fact, the facts are these: hundreds of executive nominations on this executive calendar have been approved with the slightest blip by this Senate. Republicans and Democrats, only four nominees were felt to involve such extraordinary circumstances that we were determined to prevent those individuals from taking office for very good reasons, we thought, by the use of the 60-vote rule. Only 4 out of hundreds this year. And yet that was given as an excuse to the American people to break the rules, to change the rules. It was a sad day. It's the kind of overreach we're seeing this week, which gets us back to the matter at hand, and it's the kind of very unfortunate overreach that has visited so much pain and hardship on the American people in regard to their health care and their health insurance coverage.
If the Senator will let me, I want to close my comments with two additional anecdotes that really strike at what Middle America is all about and what suffering and economic pain Middle America is going through right now as a result of Obamacare. Two cases. One, Michael from Dunwoody, Georgia, wrote in and said, I had a really great policy for $277 a month. The premiums were paid by my flex plan from my employer. With the excess my employer paid to my flex plan each month kept my balance increasing, and I now have $35,000 accrued. My provider canceled that plan, and my flex now offers a lesser plan. The premiums went to $550 a month. I actually joined AMAC and used their service to find a plan from a different provider. I must now pay the premiums out of my own pocket as President Obama won't allow me to use my own money from my flex plan to pay these premiums. In all caps, how is this legal? I thought it was my money. Apparently, it's only my money if I buy what Obamacare says I can buy. I had to choose a plan with a $5,000 deductible to make my premiums affordable. And lastly, Mary from Powder Springs writes, I'm an educator with the Cobb County school system. As a reactionary measure to Obamacare, the State Board of Community Health gave state employees only one company option for insurance this year. My premiums were going to be $1,800 per year higher. My deductible was going to be $2,000 higher. And the percentage of what was covered went down. We decided to go with my husband's company plan, but we are seriously concerned about what will happen to that coverage next year when the employer mandate goes into effect. Now, Michael and Mary are two average, ordinary Americans that we ought to care about in this body, and yet we are throwing under the bus with Obamacare. So, Mr. President, as we move forward over the next year, I'm in hopes that we can continue to engage on this because these problems are going to get more frequent and they're going to get more disastrous from a financial and a lack of coverage standpoint. And there's going to be an opportunity for this body to come together to look at really changing the Obamacare plan that passed in 2009, and let's come together on a plan that's meaningful, that truly does provide affordable and meaningful health care coverage for all Americans. And I thank the chair.
All time has expired. The question is on the Waters nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter.
How you doing, sir?
Mr. Warner.
On what? On that vote? He's taking the vote. I'm just doing kind of going ahead of time.
Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Chambliss, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Cruz, Donnelly, Durbin, Flake, Franken, Gillibrand, Grassley, Hagan, Hatch, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Leahy, Lee, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Mikulski, Moran, Murray, Nelson, Portman, Reed of Rhode Island, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Toomey, Udall of New Mexico, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden. Mr. Coburn, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Cornyn, Crapo, Enzi, Fisher, Hoeven, Johans, McCain, McConnell, Hall, Risch, Roberts, Sessions, Shelby, Vitter. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Heinrich, aye.
Vote aye.
Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Warner, aye.
Any senators? Any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the yeas are 77, the noes are 19. The nomination is confirmed. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Deborah Lee James of Virginia to be Secretary of the Air Force, signed by 19 senators.
Number two. Pursuant to Rule 22, the chair now directs the clerk to call the roll to ascertain the presence of a quorum.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Beckich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven. This is Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson, Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson, South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. A quorum is present.
A quorum is present. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Deborah Lee James of Virginia to be Secretary of the Air Force shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin.
Senate will be in order. Clerk will continue to call the roll.
Mr. Baucus, Mr. Beckich, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins.
See you tomorrow? They're here. Yeah.
Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp. Where'd she go? She's back there. All right. Mr. Heller. Yes, sir. Mr. Rono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson, Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson, South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. McCaskill. Mr. Reed. Mr. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Where? Thank you. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Bekich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson, South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Grassley, Heller, Hoeven, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Aye. Okay, so after you...
Any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the ayes are 58, the nays 39. The motion is approved. Clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Defense, Deborah Lee James of Virginia to be Secretary of the Air Force.